video on SPSS Assignment 2. This is Part 5 on the Dependent Samples t-test, or sometimes, according to SPSS, they call this the Paired Samples test. And so let's take a look back at our information that we reviewed in the last video on the types of t-tests. I recall that there is a one-sample t-test when we're comparing the mean of a sample to some standard value. Then in Chapter 6, you guys did an assignment on independent samples t-test where we compared the means of two independent groups, two groups that were not related to each other. So for this last version of the t-test, we are also looking at means, and the dependent samples test allows us to compare two sample means when the samples are related in some way. And so in most of the cases, you are going to have individuals that have data in more than one area, and you're going to compare the means between those two. So let's take a look at the example that Yaki uses in Chapter 7 for this. In the sample data set, there's a number of participants. I just showed 5 here. And then they responded to 2 surveys. One is about their feelings pertaining to the importance of concerns about the economy, and the second item on that was about national security. And the question is there a difference in the perceptions of people about the economy and national security? And so this is a classic example of how you might do a dependent samples t-test. The null hypothesis, you'll notice here, is actually we subtract one value from the other. And so the mean score for the economy minus the mean score for the national security question is 0. That's our null hypothesis. So really, since the individuals have 2 data points, there's some subtraction that's going on here, looking at the difference between the two. And so this null hypothesis is basically saying the difference between the means is 0. Then the alternative hypothesis would say that the difference in means is not equal to 0. So again, to use our analogy from before, since it's not equal to 0, it's not saying that it's greater than or less than, so this would be a two-tailed test. So to give another example that might be more applicable to education, we could also take a look at a pre-test, post-test type situation. So you've got a number of participants, you give them a pre-test, you apply some sort of intervention, then you look at post-test scores. Hopefully the post-test scores are going to be higher than the pre-test scores, so the dependent samples t-test would be the appropriate type of analysis that you'd want to do on that type of data set. So as we said before, any type of inferential statistical analysis is based on some sort of assumptions. And so there's 2 main assumptions for the dependent samples t-test. The first one is that the observations are independent within the group. So that you've got a group of individuals, pre-test, post-test, so the assumption would be that kids aren't cheating off one another, or they didn't influence each other to answer in a certain way on a survey. And so that's the first assumption. The second one is that the difference in the scores are normally distributed. So if you took each person's score and found the difference between them, between the 2 scores, and took all those differences and looked at them, then the assumption is that those difference scores are normally distributed. So let's see how to performance analysis in SPSS. I've got loaded up here the opinion.save dataset that's included with the assignment for Chapter 7. You can see I've got a number of participants. If I scroll down, you can see that there's 25 total. And then we've got the scores on two items, one about their level of concern about the economy, and a second item about the level of concern about national security. And so what we want to do is we want to see if there's a difference in means between the opinions about economy and the opinions about security. Obviously, these two things need to be on the same scale. So if this was a scale from 1 to 7, then both need to be on the same. You couldn't have one that was a scale of 1 to 5 and the other a scale of 1 to 10. So that should be intuitive why that is. But anyway, so to run the analysis, it's pretty simple. You just go to Analyze and then pick Compare Means, and then go down to the Paired Samples t-test. Recall that Waliaki calls it the Dependent Samples t-test. SPSS calls it the Paired Samples t-test. And so the dialog screen comes up. And so it asks for pairs of variables that you're going to compare. So if you had a whole long list there, you could actually perform a number of comparisons at the same time. But for our case, all we need to do is we need to send the economy over there and then security over there. And so now I've got the two variables that we're going to include in the analysis. And then the next step is just to go ahead and click OK. And so when I do that, our output comes up right away. And we can see the dialog at the top here. Here's the coding that's back behind the actual analysis. And then under paired sample statistics, we can see the mean for the economy group. So those 25 individuals, their average score on the economy question was 5.76, and their average score on the security question was 4.6. I can see there were 25 individuals included in each of those calculations, and here's the standard deviation or the spread outness of the data for both of those items. Then when we look at the next one here, we can see that they've performed a correlation between the two to see how those scores correlate across all 25 people. And then finally, at the bottom, the data that we really need to answer our question. Recall the question was about, our hypothesis was about the difference in the means. So this mean right here actually shows the difference in the two means. So if you look up here, you can see 5.76 minus 4.6 gives us that mean. So that's really the mean difference between the two. So they've subtracted the means for both of those items. And then it gives us the standard deviation of all those differences. And then down here, we've got a t-value of 3.112. And recall from the last video, if you've got a t-value of about 2 or greater, usually that's significant. The degrees of freedom is our number of individuals minus 1. That's something you're going to need to know when you write up your results in using the APA format. And then finally, the significance, or the p-value, for the two-tailed test is 0.005. And you'll also recall from previous videos that since that is less than 0.05, then we have a statistically significant result. So we can say that the scores on the economy, which were, the mean was 5.76, is significantly greater than the scores on security, which was 4.6. So we can see the analysis is fairly straightforward, fairly easy to figure out the whether the difference in the means are significant. So let's go back to our slides here and move on to the next one. And look, the last thing you need to know is how to figure out the effect size. And recall that we calculated effect size as D, Cohen's D, for the last time. Same thing's true here, except the formula is a little bit different. So the formula for calculating D is the mean difference between the two items on this assessment divided by the standard deviation of the different scores. So the two things you're going to need to calculate D is this number right here, the mean, and this number here, the standard deviation. And you can see I've performed the calculation down here at the bottom, where I've taken the mean difference, which is 1.16, and divided that by the standard deviation, which is 1.86. And so you come out to Cohen's d of 0.622. So what that's telling us is that the difference between economy and security is 0.622 standard deviations difference. And so that's, again, something else that you need to report with APA. So that finally concludes things for the SPSS assignment 2. And good luck on your assignment. And I think that's due on Sunday. So good luck again.